My sincerest condolences to the relations of the innocent American people whose lives have been unjustly cut short by the two recent mass shootings in America. The first by a fascist white supremacist who wanted to send a message of terror to the African American community, and the second by a violent terrorist at Uvalde High School in Texas. And I am sorry if I mispronounced that word. My heart goes out to the victims and their families for these reprehensible acts of unconscionable evil. In 2022 alone, there have been a total of 214 mass shootings in America. 214 mass shootings in just half a year. Now, let that number sink into your head. We are not talking about some war-torn third world country like Yemen, Afghanistan, or Burkina Faso, but a nation which time and again professes to be the greatest, most progressive country in the civilized world. Words cannot describe the degree of frustration and anger that peaceful, law-abiding Americans must now feel with the sheer incompetence and ineptness of their leaders in dealing with the issue of gun violence in their society, but also the exasperating degree of hubris demonstrated by some members of the American public who refuse to acknowledge the elephant in the room, which is simply the fact that America is the country in the developed world with the most dangerously lax weapon laws. Instead, they constantly insist the solution to a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. Apparently, the solution to these egregious acts of domestic terrorism is simply to arm and train teachers so that they will be prepared in the case of an emergency. Yet one must also ask, how many mass shootings have taken place in Singapore this entire year? 0. What about South Korea? 0. What about Spain? 0. What about Italy? 0. Or what about my homeland of Malaysia, which isn't exactly a first world paradise? 0. Yet, why do American leaders, as well as these gung-ho, gun-totting, samurai sword-wielding American macho men, constantly refuse to admit that America has a serious problem of violence, largely, not completely, but largely due to its excessively lax weapon regulation laws? Now, while I do believe that more stringent weapon laws would certainly minimize the number of premeditated murders in America, I do not think that this is a viable solution for America, as the individuals who would perpetrate these acts of unspeakable horror would simply adapt with changing laws and switch to more legal options such as kitchen knives or household equipment. Of course, a gun is without question far more deadly than a knife, a saw, or a mallet, as it is not humanly possible to outrun a bullet. The founding fathers of America, furthermore, had no conception of assault rifles, which can shoot a few hundred rounds and kill a dozen people in a matter of seconds. See, American rifles in the early days of colonial America were single-shot weapons that took around a minute to reload. But even with the cumbersome nature of early American rifles, it would not be far-fetched to say that the founding fathers of America would not have deigned to allow the slaves on their plantations to own guns or anything else that could be used as a weapon against their slave masters, for that matter. Thus, the idea of the right to own a firearm or a samurai sword as a right of individual liberty and universal self-autonomy is really a moot point. You see, guns were never meant to be, an across-the-board right that was granted towards every single person in America. They were meant to be owned. Weapons were meant to be owned by the ruling class of men in order to maintain their privileges. Gun ownership is not some inalienable American freedom that was enjoyed by every American, but merely a privilege enjoyed by white, cisgendered, heterosexual men. But today I want to talk about the normalization of violence on a macrocosmic scale and how normalized physical violence and the dehumanization of the other is part and parcel of the American zeitgeist as apple pie and Kentucky bourbon. See, when famous American pacifist Desmond Doss declared that he would not raise a weapon against any of his fellow human beings, not even a Japanese soldier. His fellow American soldiers were so angry that they verbally taunted him and brutally abused him for his quote-unquote cowardice. One of his platoon mates allegedly said to him nonchalantly, "When we are out on the battlefield, Doss, I will shoot you myself." The geopolitical analyst Ben Shapiro said, and I quote, "I'm getting really sick of people who whine about civilian casualties. Maybe I'm a hard-hearted guy, but when I see in the newspapers that civilians in Afghanistan or the West Bank were killed by American or Israeli troops, I don't really care. In fact, I would rather that the good guys use the Air Force to kill the bad guys, even if it means that some civilians get killed along the way. One American soldier is worth far more than an Afghan citizen." Or what about the esteemed American philosopher, Sam Harris? "Some propositions are so dangerous that it may even be ethical to kill people for believing them. This may seem like an extraordinary claim, but it merely enunciates an ordinary fact about the world in which we live. Certain beliefs place their adherents beyond the reach of every peaceful means of persuasion, while inspiring them to commit acts of extraordinary violence against others." Okay, or what about the American pundit, Howard Stern, who's at least a bit more explicit about his genocidal intentions, He doesn't pussy behind politically correct language. "I blow up the Palestinians, blow them all up and be done with them." Or what about the former president of America, Donald Trump? "You have to take out their families. When you get these terrorists, you have to take out their families. They care about their families' lives. Don't kid yourself. When they say they don't care about their lives, you have to take out their families." Now remember, these men that I mentioned, men such as Harris, Shapiro, Stern, and yes, even Trump, are educated white-collar men who are generally respected members in their community, not uneducated, violent hillbillies. Whether we want to admit it or not, physical violence as a solution is so firmly entrenched in the American cultural zeitgeist that even rational, educated, white-collar Americans speak about it so nonchalantly, as if they were talking about tilling a farm or weeding a garden. Now, it seems that there's some American obsession with masculine pride that always involves violence when it comes down to the crunch, At the end of the day, it always seems that outmanning the other man is part and parcel of American masculinity. And basically, one would be forgiven for thinking that America was a nation that was simply obsessed with war, judging not just by the fact that America is a country that has never encountered a war it didn't like, but also by the American public's pathological fanaticism with glorifying the military and insistence on people respecting the troops, so long as they're in active duty fighting for the glory of the American empire. Of course, the very same people who demonstrate such a fanatical zeal for respecting the military don't seem quite as enthusiastic about caring for the troops when they come back from the battlefield, traumatized, destitute, homeless, and shell-shocked. See, even the most rabid of quote-unquote American patriots who decry critical race theory as quote-unquote un-American, of course, will also go all out to hide the fact that the Harlem Hellfighters came home after the First World War to a society that treated them as third-class citizens and denied military pensions to them, the very country that they'd risked their lives for. But American mass media is saturated with extreme showcasing of mindless violence, from Quentin Tarantino Gorefest to the various splatter horror films that Hollywood churns out, as well as first-person shooters like Call of Duty and Battlefield, which, by the way, first-person shooting is the most popular genre in America. Surprise, surprise. Whether we like to admit it or not, the substantial demographic of America seems to have a fetish for violence. I need to make it clear at this point that I am, of course, not blaming video games or movies for perpetuation of violence in American society, nor am I saying that every American is a violent monster. No. For every violent American, there are dozens and dozens of kind, peaceful, civilized Americans. But this does not detract from the fact that, there is a good reason why the first-person shooter is the most popular genre among American gamers, as opposed to quote-unquote sissy RPG games such as Dragon Quest or Final Fantasy. The first-person shooter offers American gamers the opportunity to fulfill their primordial fantasies the same way a pornographic film does. While a pornographic film satisfies a man's unfulfilled biological imperative for procreation, the American first-person shooter satisfies his need to channel his physical aggression from the comfort and safety of his living room. But wherefore doth America possess such a profound love for physical violence? Why does America, of all the countries in the developed world, seem to love violence so much? It's African-American gangster rap culture that apparently originated from the cracker culture of poor Southern whites, according to Republican economist Thomas Sowell, to blame for the widespread violence we see in America? I don't think so. You see, the bellicose nature of America and its pathological love for violence isn't some recent phenomenon that arose with quote-unquote degenerate gangster rap values. It goes back all the way to the time of the founding fathers, in fact. You see, modern America, like its sugar baby Israel, was meant to be a white settler colonialist nation that was founded on the basis of violence. The founding fathers of America, such as Thomas Jefferson or George Washington, never intended for it to be some pluralistic, multi-ethnic society. See, if these guys could have their way today, it would be a patriarchal, white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant ethno-state. Go look up the two words manifest destiny for further reading. And this could not be more clearly reflected in the violent coercion of Native Americans from their ancestral lands by American President Andrew Jackson, who himself was a brutal slave master. legislating the Indian Removal Act of 1830 in order to clear up the lands for nice white people, Jackson basically strong-armed the Native Americans into reservations to prevent them from mixing with white populations. Now, his rationale was such that it will separate the Indians from immediate contact with settlements of whites, free them from the power of the states, enable them to pursue happiness in their own way and under their own rude institutions, will retard the progress of decay, which is lessening their numbers, and perhaps cause them gradually under the protection of the government and through the influence of good counsel to cast off their savage habits and become an interesting, civilized, and Christian community. See, remember though that Jackson never intended to politely ask the Native Americans to move from their lands. He was determined to get them onto reservations by fair or foul. Those are his words, not mine. Okay, slaughtering those who refused to comply with his demands. Of the approximately 51,000 Native Americans who were uprooted from their homes, roughly 10 to 15,000 of them, and that's a very conservative estimate, 10 to 15,000 of them died, many of whom were killed by Jackson's thugs for resisting. From the time the colonials first arrived on the Mayflower in the 17th century and declared Massachusetts New England, to the present day, Native Americans were so violently treated, so violently ethnically cleansed from their own soil, to the extent that they now constitute a mere 2% of the American population today. Imagine that. In less than 400 years, Native Americans have been reduced to merely 2% of the American demographic. Looking at it through this historical context, the Great Replacement Conspiracy by American Nazis almost seems like projection born out of historical retrospect. Well, how about the American President Theodore Roosevelt? Yes, Theodore Roosevelt, a nice man, right? Nice Teddy Roosevelt, who was apparently too gentle to shoot a bear. Did he extend the same civility towards Native Americans or any other race he deemed to be subhuman? Let's see what he says. All men of sane and wholesome thought must dismiss with impatient contempt the plea that these continents should be reserved for the use of scattered savage tribes. Most fortunately, the hard, energetic, practical men who do all the rough pioneer work of civilization in barbarous lands are not prone to false sentimentality. The people who are the stay-at-homes are too selfish and indolent. Basement dwellers, too lacking in imagination to understand the race importance of the work which is done by their pioneer brethren in wild and distant lands. Bunch of pussies. The most ultimately righteous of all wars is a war with savages, American and Indian, Boer and Zulu, Cossack, Tartar, New Zealander and Maori, in each case the victor, horrible though many of his deeds are, has laid deep the foundations for the future greatness of a mighty people. In fact, none other than the far right's favorite Austrian philosopher in a 1928 speech spoke approvingly about how American leaders like Jackson and Roosevelt so effectively gunned down millions of quote unquote redskins and trimmed their numbers from millions to mere thousands. Yes, the most violent, genocidal, diabolical art genius of the 20th century regarded these esteemed American statesmen like Andrew Jackson and Theodore Roosevelt as his role models. That makes you wonder why he even went to war with America, since they have so much in common. Now, to be fair, every country has morally depraved leaders, okay? The difference between America and Germany, however, is that besides the fact that Germany has far stricter gun regulation, you do not see Germans, even the right wing in Germany, unless we're talking about the alt-right, idolizing Hitler in the same way you see America idolizing men like Andrew Jackson and Theodore Roosevelt as heroes. Most of these American pioneers that American history books idolize as role models were not civilized men. These were very, very violent and uncivilized men who regarded non-white races, ergo anyone who was different from them, as subhuman and deserving of violence. In the same way, you know, these violent American mass shooters or knife stabbers regard their victims with a dehumanizing streak. Until America comes to terms with the fact that it was a nation founded on bloodshed and brutality, and that maybe, just maybe, their founding fathers and genocidal cowboy pioneers were not exactly the best people to emulate, I think it will continue to be plagued by violence and incivility. In my Confucian way of thinking, society is a reflection of its leaders, and American society is a reflection of the leaders it idolizes in its history textbooks. If you want to end violence and savagery in America, stop putting violent and savage men on a pedestal. Thank you.